My name is Ahmed Salim. While undercover, I penetrated the first Al-Qaeda cell on American soil. And their leader, Sheikh Omar Abdulrahman, known as the Blind Sheikh. Why do these people hate us? How do they become terrorists? The Terrorist Diary will explain the how and why, and dissect the terrorist mentality for you.
We have some planes, just stay quiet and you'll be okay. We are turning to the airport. Don't try to make any stupid moves.
The American 11 is a hijack.
Yes.
February 1993, the first major terrorist attack on American soil. The bombers hit what they perceived to be a symbol of the United States' financial and political power, the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center. The towers held, but the countdown to their demise was launched. We resume our journey, the one that will lead us to the September 11th attacks. It started in 1979, passing through Tehran, Kabul, Mecca, Cairo, Moscow, and Washington. During the first part, we witnessed the rise of the jihadists, recruited, trained, and armed by the United States to fight against Soviets in Afghanistan. But in 1989, the world undergoes a radical change, and the USSR starts to unravel. Americans and jihadists lose their common enemy. Exhilarated by their victory against the Soviet Union, Islamists turn against their former protectors, driven by leaders whose hate of the Western world grew in Egyptian jails, such as Ayman al-Zawahiri and Sheikh Abdel Rahman, also known as the Blind Sheikh. For this particular group of Egyptians, the victory against Soviets isn't the end, but the beginning of a new battle, which they will now pursue on American soil. The FBI decides to increase its surveillance of the Sheikh, even managing to infiltrate his immediate circle, thanks to Ahmad Salem, the terrorist bomb maker who in reality is an undercover FBI agent. But following a dispute with his superiors, Ahmad abandons the mission. Terrorists are quick to find a replacement, a 34-year-old engineer, Ramzi Youssef. A few weeks later, the bomb is ready. It explodes on February 26, 1993, in the lower level of the World Trade Center. The road to terror is now a race against time, with terrorists always one step ahead, until the fateful morning of September 11, 2001. In the days that follow this first attack on the World Trade Center in New York, the FBI tries to convince Ahmad Salem to resume his undercover mission amongst the followers of Sheikh Abdel Rahman, also known as the Blind Sheikh. Ahmad accepts and rapidly manages to become his personal assistant.
used to go to his house at 7 o'clock in the morning, cook for him, serve him, and whoever come, lunch and do the dishes and take him to the bathroom. He is blind, so he cannot walk on his own, so I put the slipper to his feet and so on. One of Sheikh Omar's followers, his name is Siddiq Ali, start to discuss with me blowing up something here. And I said, that's a very good idea, and I think we should do that. And then he started with different targets, the World Trade Center again, to tell the American that we can get you anytime. And then he said there is a military armory in 96th Street. And then he started to go into different targets.
So Ahmad reported that to me within days. And then we were off to the next set of plots. We had a warehouse, that we were using as an undercover warehouse for another case. And we took that warehouse and we gave it to Ahmad to present to Siddiq Ali as a place where would be their headquarters to continue with the operation.
We had cameras in there, had El Salam wired when he was in conversation, lots of surveillance, lots of videotaping of the plotters, and watched it very, very carefully.
We spend hours and hours in the warehouse mixing chemicals and the fumes, and it's just so awful. And with the heat, if God forbid any spark or anything goes wrong, you got the entire 2-3 blocks of the city will go away. We had 5 bombs at that time. Each one is 1,500 pounds bomb, which is like similar to the Oklahoma bomb in the magnitude of it. One for Holland Tunnel, one for Lincoln Tunnel, one for Washington Bridge, one for the United Nations, and one for the FBI building.
Potentially, it was very, very dangerous. I mean, obviously, we tried to control it as best we could with the informant and the surveillances, but the plot was essentially to blow up the bridges and tunnels connecting New York and New Jersey, the UN building, the Manhattan FBI building, simultaneously, really. And thousands of people, was the plot, would die by drowning in the tunnels connecting the 2 states here in the New York area. So, it was a plot of tremendous dimension and potential extreme danger.
The FBI, in control of the overall operation, decides to close in on the head of the network. For the investigators, it's the blind sheikh. He's the one who, in the name of Allah, authorizes and even encourages the faithful to attack Americans. With a wire on, Ahmad will try to compromise Rahman.
We go to the kitchen. It's a very small space. And then I told him that Siddiq and I start to build something big, very big for the United Nations. What do you think? It is permissible or it is illicit? So Sheikh Omar answered, it is not illicit, it is okay, but don't do it. I said, don't do it. Why? He said, it is better. And then he put his mouth into my left ear because I'm holding him in my left arm, and he started to whisper.
This recording by Ahmad Salem is, for the American justice system, the proof of the Sheikh's implication in the network's terrorist acts. On the night of June 24, 1993, Mary Jo White gives the FBI orders to arrest the entire network. Apprehended soon afterwards, the blind sheikh is sentenced to life imprisonment. But the perpetrator of the first 1993 attack on the World Trade Center is still at large. For Americans, Ramzi Youssef is now considered public enemy number one.
Ramzi Youssef, while born in Kuwait, was born of Pakistani and Palestinian parents. So the Palestinian cause would have been something inculcated in him from early childhood on, and the enmity towards the West, but Israel in particular, was something deeply seared within him. Here was a man with very powerful educational credentials to play a very active role in designing airborne explosives and in technically planning operations. One of the interesting aspects about Ramzi Youssef is his family connection. He is the nephew of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who was the architect of the 9/11 attack. So we have a family tradition of radicalism here. And to add to that, both had connections to Sheikh Abdul Rahman.
At the end of 1994, the jihad has a new battleground, the Philippines. Arab fighters flock towards a country in the throes of Islamist guerrilla warfare. Amongst them are Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and his nephew, Ramzi Youssef. The two partners in crime have many projects. Posing as businessmen, they meet in bars in Manila, mostly karaoke bars, to ensure their conversations cannot be recorded. An exotic setting, but nothing deviates them from their mission. Stars spreading in the New York, New York. Perhaps they heard the famous song as an ironic nod to their own obsessions. Both men develop relationships with local Manila girls who are happy to go out with rich businessmen. They will use them to carry out their plans, asking them to buy components needed to manufacture their next bombs. At first, they plan on assassinating Bill Clinton, but they finally choose to target the Pope, scheduled to come to Manila in January of 1995. Ramzi creates a new devilish device that is untraceable.
He was here to perfect a bomb that would become an invention of the decade, or if not the century, which is a liquid bomb. Okay, that cannot be detected by metal detector in the airport. And he tested this bomb in several locations. One of the tests that he conducted was to put this liquid bomb in a theater in Manila. It's called Greenbelt Theater. Okay, he ordered Khalid Sheikh Mohammed to put the liquid bomb below the seat of the movie house. So it exploded at around 10:30 in the evening.
Only one person is wounded in the theater, but the test is conclusive. The next step, the installation of an explosive device on a commercial airliner. Ramzi Youssef boards a plane in Manila headed for Japan. During the layover on the island of Cebu, he disappears, leaving the device under his seat. The bomb explodes according to plan, killing a passenger, but the pilot manages to land the plane in Japan. Just one row of seats away, the plane would have exploded mid-flight.
I flew to Manila at the time to investigate what was going on, but we had no clear notion yet of what was actually planned. And when the intelligence emerged about the plot, and the intelligence emerged actually accidentally, just as a result of a fire in the apartment where explosives were being concocted in Manila, I was shocked by the audacity of the plot and the cleverness of it. The plot involved the destruction simultaneously over the Pacific of 11 U.S. passenger aircraft, and it very nearly succeeded.
Indeed, the plot is foiled at the last moment when a fire breaks out in the apartment where Ramsey makes his bombs. Ramsey flees but leaves his computer behind, on which the police discover the details of an operation codenamed Bojinka. One of his accomplices, Abdul Hakim Murad, a commercial airline pilot, is arrested. He's interrogated by Colonel Mendoza, a veteran fighter against Islamist rebels, who threatens to deliver him to the Israeli intelligence agency, the Mossad.
You are telling 50% truth, 50% liar. Maybe if this lie will exceed 50%, I will not waste my time again here and deliver it to you, to the Israeli again. I'm becoming impatient. You are creating stories that are unbelievable. But I'm starting to believe on him. Why? Because I have seen his eyes. He's not winking. He can see me eye to eye. And that's what I'm after. I have seen these eyes long time ago, several times. So this guy is telling me the truth.
Analyzing the computer's contents, investigators then discover new elements. It's the follow-up to the Bojinka plan, whose concept is radically new.
That's the biggest surprise. When the third component of the Ublan Bojinka is the seizing commercial aircraft in the continental U.S., controlling it, and diving specifically to Langley, Virginia, okay, and other targets. How did you know this? Because Ramsey Joseph is telling me. So you are admitting that you are one of the pilots. Mr. Murad, I remember that you told me that you studied pilot here. Who are your companions? There is a pilot training in the U.S. So I was again mesmerized. He is emphasizing, Mr. Murad is emphasizing that it is a suicide attack using an aircraft.
Do you think that some of the pilots of 9/11 were already in 95 ready to operate?
Yeah, based on my analysis, some of them might be there already. I have reasons to believe that it was the blueprint of 9/11.
The word that reached Washington through CIA reporting, largely this was CIA stationed in Manila reporting back. The CIA representatives that sat around the table in the White House focused our attention on a plot to simultaneously blow up a number of aircraft in midair by planting bombs on the aircraft and then getting off the aircraft at the next stop. And the bomb would go off as the plane went on. And there was a great deal of attention on that and a great deal of activity. But CIA never said to us, don't just do that, start thinking about planes flying into buildings.
The information coming out of the Philippines is, however, crucial. 6 years before the September 11th attacks, terrorists had already conceived the idea of using commercial airliners as lethal weapons, ones that would prove tragically effective.
There was no culture of recognizing that the Islamic threat would include people themselves committing suicide, not breaking down the door and saying, take me to Cuba. It was, we're all gonna die.
perceptions of the entire U.S. government weren't really aligned with emerging realities. Attitudes about the threat environment change only over time, and they generally change slowly. Oftentimes, they just change with generational change. Or, if there's some horrific event that challenges the prevailing assumption.
America is shell-shocked by the Oklahoma City bombing. The American right wing is quickly held responsible. A federal government building was the target, leaving 168 dead and over 700 wounded. The bomber, Timothy McVeigh, will be sentenced to death. However, one potential lead at the start of the investigation seems to not have been completely explored to this day. No one seems to heed the fact that his accomplice, Terry Nichols, happened to be a few months before in the Philippines and in the same city as Ramzi Youssef.
We know that Terry Nichols was having difficulty in making a bomb that worked. And shortly after he came back from the Philippines, he seemed to have figured out how to make a bomb that worked. We know that Terry Nichols and Ramzi Youssef, both people were in the same city at the same time. That's odd. Both people were interested in making bombs. Both people opposed the American government. Is it conceivable that in a mid-sized Philippine city, that two people who were interested in making bombs and hated the American government could have found each other somehow? I think it's conceivable.
U.S. authorities decide to bring out the big guns to arrest Ramzi Youssef. A $2 million reward is issued for his capture. His portrait is printed on hundreds of thousands of tracts distributed throughout Pakistan, where he is now in hiding. On February 7, 1995, he is betrayed and arrested. But Khalid Sheikh Mohammed is still at large.
We found him in Qatar, where our sources indicated he was working for the Qatari government in the water ministry. We wanted him very badly. And I assumed if he was working in the government, somebody in the government got him that job. And if we went into the Qatari government and said, please arrest this man and give him to us, the chances of them doing that were probably pretty low. And so I wanted the FBI, working with CIA, to go in and just steal him, do an extradition. Don't tell the Qatari government. FBI said it didn't have the capability to do a snatch overseas. So we said, okay, CIA, you do it. CIA said, well, we don't have a CIA station in Qatar, and we really don't have snatch teams. So we said, well, U.S. military, Special Forces, Delta Force, we know you have people trained to do snatches. And they said, yes, we do, but in order to do that, we need 2,000 troops, helicopters, aircraft carriers to back us up, which would have given away that there was something up.
These departments and agencies don't naturally work together. They don't naturally cooperate. And as a result, it's important to have some group of people who can herd these cats, who can get them all together, going in the same direction, and cooperating with each other, because, in fact, to do what they really need to do, they need to cooperate. But it doesn't come naturally. It can, on occasion, be done. But it requires a National Security Council staff that knows the agencies very well, understands how they work, and has a structure in place to get these cats into the same room and agree, while they are there, to do things that need to be done. and the cats need to be represented at sufficiently high levels so that you're talking to decision-making cats.
That left the White House no choice but to tell the Qatari government. So I spoke to our ambassador in Doha and said, you have to go straight to the top. You have to deal with the emir. Tell the emir he can't tell anybody about this. He just needs to get a very trusted group of his military people and go pick the guy up. And they won't have to hold him for very long because we'll land a plane and we'll take him off their hands. And almost as soon as our ambassador had done that, he disappeared from the country. He'd obviously been told by somebody in the Qatari government. I think if we had got him then, it would not have stopped bin Laden from wanting to do an attack in the U.S. But it might have eliminated the one man in the bin Laden organization, because he had by then become a member of Al-Qaeda, who was actually capable of carrying it out.
During the same period, in the middle of the 90s, Saudi Arabia is facing an important surge of Sunnite extremism. The United States and the Western world in general do not yet realize the impact the radicalization of Sunnite Islam will have in the years to come.
They were raised in an era when the Palestinians were the main terrorists, the Red Brigades were the Red terrorists, and by the middle of the 90s, the Shias, the Hezbollah, and Iranian connection were the big deal. So throughout the 90s, there was an enormous problem trying to convince governments that the Sunnis were developing into a very serious threat. And because of the size of the Sunni population and its geographical dispersion, ultimately a much more serious threat than the Shia.
I had several conversations with people in the royal family and in the Saudi government about the question of the radicalization of some Saudis through the Afghan experience. There were sermons in mosques that were very reactionary and quite extremist and threatening. The people I spoke with, I think, displayed an unfortunate degree of complacency. They did not take the threats sufficiently seriously.
This man dressed in gray near King Fahd is Bakr bin Laden. He's one of Saudi Arabia's most powerful men and the brother of Osama bin Laden.
I know probably 11 of Osama's brothers. Each one is very different. I have a high regard for all of them. Every family has its black sheep, and unfortunately this one was very black.
Osama bin Laden was the 17th of 22 to 24 sons. There were a total of 52 to 54 children. What was unusual about Osama bin Laden is he was the only child of the last marriage of Mohammed bin Laden to Hamida, a woman of Palestinian descent, a Syrian woman, supposed to be remarkably beautiful, but rather spirited and not submissive at all. This was not a marriage that lasted long, and he quickly tired of her and divorced her. She became known as Al-Abida, the slave, and her only child, in contrast to the other wives, each of whom had 2 or 3 children with Mohammed bin Laden, the only child was Osama bin Laden, and he had the nickname of Ibn al-Abida, the son of the slave. It is not unreasonable to speculate that his later challenging of the Saudi royal family represented a challenging of paternal authority the paternal authority which had led the way in rejecting his mother and him as the teased son of the slave.
To fully understand bin Laden's emergence, one must go back a few years, more precisely to 1992 during the First Gulf War. That's when he has his first conflict with the Saudi royal family.
When Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, of course, Osama bin Laden wasn't happy that Saudi Arabia will bring foreign troops into Saudi Arabia. I'm sure the king himself wasn't happy to bring foreign troops. Nobody will be happy over that, but it was a work of necessity. So Osama suggested an alternative, that rather than bringing foreign troops, I can bring thousands of Arab mujahideen and we can fight Saddam Hussein house to house in Kuwait. That suggestion never flew, never was taken seriously. Number one, there is no guarantee of success. Number two, it could lead to a greater war between Saudi Arabia and Iraq. And in fact, if Osama bin Laden succeeded, he would become a hero. But maybe nobody wants him to become a hero also. But it was ridiculous.
Bin Laden had come to our attention because his money was increasingly linked to people that the U.S. was worried about. I think we used to talk about him as the Ford Foundation for Terrorism. And he was very generous.
At first, it's through his financial support of several attacks occurring since the 1980s that Americans first notice bin Laden. Estranged from the Saudis, he runs in exile to Sudan and then to Afghanistan. In February of 1996, he officially declares war on the United States via a fax sent to several newspapers around the world. At the same time, a renegade from bin Laden's network reveals important information to the Americans. His name is Jamal al-Fadl. What he tells the investigators will allow them to infiltrate the al-Qaeda network for the first time.
We know from Jamal, Ahmad al-Fadl, that he was tasked by bin Laden to get fissionable material. So you can interpret declare war anywhere that you want. I mean, I think you have to remember what bin Laden's words were when he issued his fatwa, or religious order. And let me paraphrase those for you, because I think this is very important. Bin Laden said it was the duty of every good Muslim to kill Americans wherever they find them. Not only Americans, but their allies. So that would include French citizens, that would include British citizens, that would include anybody that's allied with the United States. Now, if somebody declares war against you and somebody says to you that you're a legitimate target, and if somebody wants to murder you, I take that pretty seriously.
Bin Laden's declaration follows certain Islamic customs, which impose warning an enemy of one's intentions. This declaration of war signals to American authorities for the first time a truly established threat. As broad as it is vague, it is now addressed against all citizens, most of whom have never even heard of Osama bin Laden. But for now, Americans try to act indirectly by pressuring their allies, such as Saudi Arabia.
We worked with the Saudis to deal with him somehow. It was hoped that the Saudis would be able to win him back to the fold. And with, inducements of one kind or another, the promise of repatriation and, perhaps promises of reform or what have you, that the bin Laden would simply be reabsorbed into the, Salafi society in Saudi Arabia, and that would be that.
We had talks. We will particularly in the last meeting we had together in 1995. I was hoping that I can bring him back to moderate camp. I tried to get him to speak against terrorist attack which took place a few months before in Saudi Arabia, which could lead to the breaking the ice between him and the government, and maybe later through his family we can get another gesture from the government in order to bring him back to Saudi Arabia. Unfortunately, he wasn't independent enough. He was under the influence of the Egyptian radicals.
Osama bin Laden is now at home in Afghanistan. His men are preparing for jihad in training camps. By his side, a comrade in arms from the war against the Soviets, the Egyptian Ayman al-Zawahiri. Since the trial of President Sadat's assassins, this doctor has entered his own crusade against his successor, Hosni Mubarak, as well as infidels from the world over. Zawahiri will do everything in his power to have bin Laden join his holy war.
When Ayman al-Zawahiri joined bin Laden in 1997, he said, what you are doing now is rubbish. You should know your enemy and you should deal with the enemy in a way which you manipulate his power and convert him into becoming your public relations company. I said, how do I do it? He said, Americans, when you irritate them in a special way, they will react in a cowboy manner. They do not think. They do not sit down and read the matter carefully and wisely and decide how to respond. And he said, okay, first thing you do, forget about attacking American installations in the Gulf, find a symbol of American power and make a statement talking about every American as a target. So the American identity is your enemy. And because Muslims are looking at America as a reason of their suffering, number one, it is supporting Israel. Number two, it is a very close ally to all puppet regimes, despotic regimes in the Arab and Muslim world. And number three, it is killing the Iraqis by its embargo. So there is enough reason for Muslims to hate America, and you need to appear in front of Muslims as the savior, as the person who is antagonizing this devil in the minds of Muslims.
Al-Zawahiri and bin Laden immediately carry out their strategy. The target, 2 U.S. embassies, one in Nairobi, Kenya, and the other in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. Their modus operandi, the simultaneous explosion of 2 bombs carried by suicide bombers. The toll is heavy, 224 dead and 5,000 wounded, Kenyans and Tanzanians for the most part. The U.S. is completely taken by surprise. This is the real wake-up call regarding a danger Americans took too long to assess. August 20th, 13 days later, comes the response. Bill Clinton orders 2 series of missile firings on targets in Afghanistan and Sudan. He is following al-Zawahiri's intended plan to a T.
Our target was terror. Our mission was clear: to strike at the network of radical groups affiliated with and funded by Osama bin Laden, perhaps the preeminent organizer and financier of international terrorism in the world today.
Nobody knew who he was. Suddenly, all of the American media were talking about him, trying to find out who he was. We ended up firing $1 million missiles at $10,000 tents. I thought this was a terrible mistake. This man was not very important. We made him a celebrity.
Stung into action, the Muslim world rises up against the American reprisal. Al-Zawahiri's strategy continues to work.
When this attack was mentioned in the news,
there was 50% support or against in the Muslim world. When Clinton stood up on the platform and started talking about bin Laden as an enemy, there was almost like 99% of support of bin Laden, because the psychology is completely different. Somebody is there, is pleasing the Muslims that you've got your savior who has been able to be a proper opponent to the Americans. They believed in Jamal Abdel Nasser before and turned out to be hopeless. They believed in Saddam, turned out to be hopeless. They believed in Gaddafi, turned out to be hopeless. And they got them. They got the savior.
The Saudis, by 1998, had come to the conclusion that bin Laden was a threat to us and also to the royal family. And they were willing to move against him. But their preference was always to do it in a Saudi way, which is to persuade the Taliban or the Pakistanis to turn him over to them, rather than to use extreme measures like drone strikes or guided missile strikes. Those the Saudis felt only created a larger myth about bin Laden.
The Saudis failed to convince the Taliban, Afghanistan's new masters, to give them bin Laden. The U.S. then attempts to go all out by going to negotiate directly in Kabul. Bruce Riedel is part of the expedition.
It was a meeting between Mars and Venus in many ways. We sat in chairs, the Taliban sat on the floor. We brought briefcases, the Taliban brought AK-47s and RPGs. We tried to convince them that Osama bin Laden was an international terrorist. They were convinced that he was a jihadist holy warrior.
Less than 12 hours after the double bombing attack, while rescue teams are getting organized, FBI agent John Antisev arrives on site. With him are 200 special agents who will pursue the investigation.
It was a disaster. You're not prepared to see an embassy totally gutted from one side to the other. From the blast, took everything out from the rear to the front. The Secretarial College that was next door to the embassy had completely pancaked.
A suspect is quickly identified in one of the city's hotels. His name is Mohammed Sadiq Odeh, and John Antisev is in charge of interrogating him.
I knew he was the bomber. I knew he was Mujahideen. And I didn't ask him if he was in Afghanistan. I asked him, where were you fighting in Afghanistan? And he couldn't help it. And he said, I was in Jalalabad. So I knew from doing all these interviews over the years that was a very important place to fight and a big battle. So I said, you must have been very brave. And he said, yes, I was. So I knew I had him. I said, if I was in his shoes, well, I have to call somebody to say I'm alive, get me out of here. So I put a pencil in his hand and I said, write down the first number you called when you got back to the hotel. Well, I kind of slapped my hand. I tried to shock him a little bit. Not too bad. And he wrote down this number, and it turned out to be, unbeknownst to me, that was a very famous number that was used in Yemen, at a safe house in Yemen that was used by bin Laden. That was the proof that showed that this was an Al-Qaeda attack right away.
The number given to Antisev is the one for this house in Yemen. Its purpose, a communication link for all telephone conversations between bin Laden in Afghanistan and his men all over the world. The National Security Agency wiretaps the number, but meanwhile, America has become fascinated by a completely different story.
And Monica Lewinsky says that while you were in the Oval Office area, you touched her breast. Would she be lying?
That is not my recollection. My recollection is that I did not have sexual relations with Ms. Lewinsky, and I'm staying on my former statement about that.
If Monica Lewinsky says that you used a cigar as a sexual aid with her in the Oval Office area, would she be lying? Yes, no, or won't answer?
I will revert to my former statement.
When we discussed retaliation with President Clinton, we were aware that people might say, look, this is an attempt to divert attention from your political problem. And he got very mad at us, and said, look, my political problem is mine, and I'm the guy who makes decisions about political things, and I have political advisors. You're my security advisors. Don't talk to me about politics. You give me your best national security judgment, and let me layer in a political consideration if I think there is one. But don't you tell me about politics. So, fine.
But the information provided by the CIA is not always reliable. This factory in Khartoum, Sudan is pelted with missiles, wrongly suspected of manufacturing chemical weapons for bin Laden. On the same day, 75 missiles are launched on training camps where bin Laden is identified by the CIA, but he changes his plans, and once again, the missiles miss their main target.
The fact is that in 1998-1999, our intelligence collection in Afghanistan wasn't what we wanted. And after an experience such as we had on August 20th with the two strikes, the bar went up, and the ability to take another shot, to send either cruise missiles or what have you into the region, and then to miss another target, that was really hard to imagine. So we needed to have very, very solid intelligence because, quite frankly, a president can't just go around dropping bombs on possible targets.
We had been going about this in what I thought was the wrong way. Retaliating, so they blow up an embassy, we blow up a camp, that's not solving the problem. That could go on forever. Instead of retaliating, I thought you have to change the approach and talk about destroying.
Richard Clarke takes matters into his own hands. He wants to get rid of Al-Qaeda. He puts together a global attack plan, codenamed Delenda, a Latin name that means must be destroyed. The plan includes an all-out strategy, diplomatic, financial, and military. But on this last point, the different U.S. government bodies do not agree.
The key element in Delenda was never approved, and that was a sustained bombing campaign of the Al-Qaeda camps in Afghanistan. No one would ever agree to that. We were bombing Iraq frequently because of the no-fly zone. We were bombing in the former Yugoslavia. And there were a lot of people in the State Department and the White House who said, America already appears to be the mad bomber. It's bombing all over the world. Air Force, cruise missiles. We don't need a third country where we're bombing all the time.
Meanwhile, the investigation on Al-Qaeda is making progress, thanks in part to the phone number of the house in Yemen obtained by FBI agent John Antisef. The wiretaps enable the CIA to retrieve crucial information. A top Al-Qaeda meeting is scheduled for January 5, 2000 in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. But in return, the CIA does not communicate this essential information to the FBI.
That, in my mind, is a very, very critical meeting. It's 16 or 18 months before 9/11, and as we now know, some of the people that attended that meeting were part of the plot for 9/11.
A complete communication breakdown between both agencies. While the FBI is attempting to lay hands on a suspected terrorist network, the CIA does not provide them with the intel that two of its members have just landed on American soil, thanks to legally obtained multiple entry visas.
Khalid al-Midhar and Nawaf al-Hazmi are obviously two very important players in 9/11. Both are pilots, both trained. and they were at the meeting in Kuala Lumpur. So this is my theory. My theory is that if you tell us about these two guys in the United States 16 or 18 months before the attacks of 9/11, I mean, are those two people we might want to be interested in? Of course. What could we have done 16 or 18 months? First of all, we could put them under surveillance. First of all, we can probably get their phones wiretapped. I think we can make an argument that they're agents of a foreign power. Secondly, we could compromise their computers. We could look at every chat room that they went to, every internet cafe, every wire transfer that they made. We would have all this information. Do you think we would be in the middle of the conspiracy for 9/11? I think you can make a very strong argument that we would have been at least one part of it.
And yet at the time, the fight against Al-Qaeda is entrusted to a special unit that includes representatives of both the FBI and the CIA. Called Alex Station, it's a standalone and independent unit that operates under its own rules in an anonymous suburb of Washington, D.C.
And of course the Bureau should have been notified. The Bureau should have been told automatically. We couldn't find any logical reason why we could not let the FBI know. See, you write a cable, you're the originator, and then you electronically forward it to your, so to speak, immediate supervisor, if you will. And I was the more senior agent, so it came to me. I read it, clicked it, hit it to the next person that's in the queue to electronically approve it, tweak it, whatever they want to do. And then it finally gets released. And it never got beyond the person that I had sent it to. So I went and spoke to the person, and that's when they told me that it's not going. This is not an FBI case. This is a CIA matter. The next attack of Al-Qaeda is going to happen in Southeast Asia. When and if we want the FBI to know, we'll let them know.
So 2 of the future 9/11 hijackers are now somewhere on American territory. The countdown has entered its last phase. The decision not to share with the FBI information that concerns them directly appears outrageous today, but it stems from a common practice at the time between departments. Nicknamed the Chinese Wall, its purpose is the protection of sources and agency contacts, absolutely vital in the world of intelligence.
There was a real problem with terrorism, how you approach terrorism, whether you were in intelligence or whether you were in law enforcement. Intelligence tried to collect as much as information as you could, let it run so that it could lead to other elements of the terrorist plot, and you would let it run for a long time, even taking some risk. For example, if the group you had penetrated was followed for too long a period, maybe they'll take an action that will kill people, and you didn't move fast enough on it. The FBI's objective was to get it quickly as soon as it was at hand. If you knew someone was involved in a terrorist group, you wanted to arrest him right away. CIA has to do it, and had to do it for a long time, dealing with bad people, bad guys. The fact that these were people with blood on their hands, yes, because to collect information on a terrorist group, you weren't going to deal with nuns or priests.
It is now 18 months before the September 11 attacks. The CIA knows of the existence of at least 2 future hijackers, Khalid al-Mihdhar and Nawaf al-Hazmi. They are part of a group that will soon be coordinated by a young Egyptian student, one whose name will be remembered by history, Mohammed Atta. Mohammed Atta met bin Laden in 1998 in Afghanistan. The Al-Qaeda leader notices the young man for his bravery and athletic prowess. But for now, Mohammed Atta seems like any other student studying urbanism at a technical university in Hamburg.
He's not so much different from so many young people, and that's what's so scary. I got scared at a certain point. I'm Egyptian like him. I went to Cairo University like he did. I went to the American University for my MA. He went to the American University for an English language course. Then I went to Europe to do my PhD. I went to Scotland. He went to Germany to do his master's. Well, I could be a terrorist. But of course not. He was frustrated also with the US foreign policy, with what the Israelis have been doing to the Palestinians and the rest of it. Now, I know that some people in the West don't particularly like to hear anything that's to do with the foreign policy because they think that this might be a justification for terrorism. I don't think it is a justification for terrorism in any sense, but at the same time, if you totally ignore what you think or even what people like these say to you that these are our grievances and you completely dismiss them off, I think we'll always have a problem.
Upwards of 80% of the new terrorists are being socialized in a radical direction within the diaspora. It's important to identify the feeling of alienation and insignificance and non-acceptance he felt in Europe. And he's not alone in that. There's major problems in Great Britain, there's major problems in Spain, in France. And then when you have a sense-making radical imam saying to you, this is what makes sense, this is the reason you are not feeling successful in this world, and also transforming the future. It isn't death, he's going to paradise.
Muhammad Atta's itinerary then brings him to Florida, through a little town called Venice. The young student from Hamburg arrives in this resort, whose population is mostly elderly Americans enjoying a peaceful retirement. 3 of the 4 pilots that operated the planes on 9/11 were trained at this little flight school in Venice. Atta's itinerary actually raises a number of questions. We know he came and took flying lessons on small private planes. However, we also know he already had several flying permits. Why did he come to this place in particular, when there are over 250 flying schools in Florida alone? An American journalist has spent a number of years trying to find answers to these questions. But the deeper he digs, the more questions arise. At its core is the central role and strategy of the CIA itself.
The important thing to understand about the Venice airport is its location and its situation. In its location, it backs right up against the Gulf of Mexico, which means that you can take off and land there, without being seen by anyone anywhere else on land, and no one here is going to see you either because this airport does not have a tower, meaning there is no police presence here at all.
Taking advantage of this strategic position, ever since World War II, the CIA has been regularly using the little airport in Venice for its undercover operations with drug cartels. Along the runways is the pilot training school, the one Mohammed enrolled in 13 months before the 9/11 attacks.
Before September 11th, this was a flight school, which was owned by a guy named Stan Huffman. A tiny little flight school in Florida trained local pilots to fly, like any other flight school does. Then, Wally Hilliard and Rudy Deckers walked in and made Stan Huffman a cash offer. It wasn't for sale. Made him a cash offer for his business worth twice what it's worth. Stan Huffman took it and left. Immediately, they began importing foreign students. And eventually, there were 80% of the flight students here at Huffman Aviation and at their second flight school in Naples, Florida, were Arab and foreigners. There was an operation of some sort going on here that had nothing to do with teaching people to fly. The man that owned this flight school when Muhammad Atta was here had his Learjet confiscated, seized by DEA agents with submachine guns at Orlando Executive Airport 3 weeks after Muhammad Atta arrived here, and the DEA agents found 43 pounds of heroin on the plane. Again, it brings up the question of why were they here, okay? If they just picked Venice, Florida out of a hat, we have one story. If, however, they came to Venice, Florida because the CIA had been running operations in Venice, Florida for 40 years by the time they got here, we have another story.
There are now only a few pieces left to complete the puzzle. These pieces are the future hijackers who are starting to regroup in the United States. A race against the clock has begun, between a spinning web that nothing appears to be able to stop and U.S. authorities deeply divided on what best strategy to adopt. While the CIA pursues its covert operations, a U.S. Army intelligence unit launches a new program, a secret one, to track down Al-Qaeda. Codenamed Able Danger, it rests upon the use of ultra-sophisticated computers capable of sifting through millions of electronic databases. Based on the analysis of profiles of known terrorists, it is capable of identifying any connection deemed suspicious by the intelligence community. During the year 2000, an Able Danger official receives a file describing a cell of Islamists in Brooklyn. Among them is a photograph of Muhammad Atta.
We didn't recognize the importance of the information. We identified him and the others as core members of Al-Qaeda and as being part of the effort here in the United States, and that they met the profile of others who were attending the mosques here, and more importantly, that were affiliated with the Brooklyn cell. The Brooklyn cell being that of the individuals who conducted 93 World Trade Center bomber. They were part of that group that we wanted to tell the FBI about, to say, you need to look at these guys. We didn't target them as individuals, we looked at them as part of a group. So it was this group we were focused on, not on individuals. We were prohibited from looking at individuals because of their status of being here legally. That's where we were told to stop.
And you were prohibited to tell the FBI?
We were prohibited from telling the FBI, yes.
Al-Qaeda strikes again. Not in Asia, where the CIA was expecting it, but in the Gulf of Aden off the coast of Yemen. A U.S. warship, the missile launcher USS Cole, is hit by a suicide bombing attack, a motorboat filled with explosives. The USS Cole is one of the most sophisticated ships in the U.S. fleet. 17 Marines are killed and 39 are wounded. And yet, starting from the beginning of October, the analysts of Able Danger tried to warn the authorities. They had indeed noticed intense activity amongst terrorist networks in the area, and they were convinced an attack was imminent.
I was trying to tell them, you really need to look at this information. The FBI was not all that enthusiastic either, because they knew about the restrictions on them. So it was there was no positive incentives, it was all negative. Both sides didn't want to talk because of this wall memo. And people like me who were just trying to do our jobs were held back. And it was very frustrating. Had that been given to law enforcement, there's a very good chance law enforcement could have done something to check them out and arrest them for what they were doing.
The investigation following the Cole bombing creates huge tension between government agencies. Rivalries and mutual misunderstanding are undermining the capacity for action and reaction of the United States. The FBI sends John O'Neill to pursue his own investigation on site. Known for his hot temper, he clashes with local U.S. Ambassador Barbara Bodine. But beyond personality issues, the diverging priorities of each different institution are at the heart of the conflict. Later, on 9/11, John O'Neill would perish in one of the World Trade Center towers.
Bureau comes in and says 17 sailors were killed, countless were maimed, U.S. property was damaged. Okay? Someone has to go to jail for that. CIA comes in and says, that's all great. That's wonderful. We're going to get these guys, we're going to round them up, but we're going to continue to operate and try to gather intelligence and sources to get further in that network. And, all right, maybe we don't want to arrest that guy at that time. Maybe we want to keep him or her out there. And maybe we might have to deal a little bit with the bad devil in the government over there or make a friend here and there that we don't necessarily don't want to, but it's for a greater long-term strategic view. Then you have the State Department, who doesn't look at the CIA view or the FBI view. It looks 50 years down the road. As an FBI agent, I don't really give a damn about your 50-year long-term view. I care about the evil sons of bitches that kill these sailors. And I could care less about any politician or politic. And that's the conflict. And John comes in there and says, people got to go to jail, and my men need to be protected. And there's the conflict.
Being one of the government's heads and in charge of counterterrorism, Richard Clarke is fully aware of this race against time. He tries to convince President Clinton to grant him further means to track down the network's leader, bin Laden.
We got approval from the president to do an experiment. So in September and October of 2000, we flew the Predator unmanned over Afghanistan, and we found bin Laden. And we watched bin Laden live we were sitting in Virginia, watching TV screens, and we knew exactly where he was and what he was doing in a camp in Afghanistan. The image was coming off the Predator, bouncing up to a satellite, bouncing back down to us in Virginia. We saw him live, but at the time, the Predator was only a reconnaissance aircraft. It had never had a weapon on it. It wasn't built to have a weapon on it. But we had proved that we could find bin Laden, and we would know in real time where he was.
Good evening.
But George W. Bush's coming to power will create a considerable delay in the fight against al-Qaeda. The controversy surrounding the vote count has further disrupted the transfer of information from the former administration to the new one.
What did they worry about? Star Wars, the Ronald Reagan plan for ballistic missile defense. High on their list, probably the first thing that they talked about, was negotiating with Moscow on a ballistic missile defense. Now, time had moved on. There really was no need, certainly not as a priority, to deal with ballistic missile defense. And we were not about to go to war with the Soviet Union or Russia. Nobody was about to fire ballistic missiles at each other. This was not an urgent priority, but it was their number one priority. And after that, they worried about China and Iraq, things that they had been working on 8 years earlier. They were aware the world had changed, but it hadn't changed their agenda.
There was chatter, as we say, in the global jihadist community that something big was coming. Chatter is just that. It doesn't tell you what, where, when, and who.
There were a lot of indications, a lot of separate sources, human sources, communication sources, that told us that people in the al-Qaeda network believed a major attack was coming. A major attack against Americans' interests.
Certain elements of the United States government understood exactly what that meant. It wasn't just idle threat. I mean, he bombed the embassies, he attacked the coal, the first World Trade Center, and whatever else he had done. I mean, and we were feeding information all the time.
The intention
was very clear. Bin Laden said he was going to attack us. He said he was going to attack us with increasing ferocity if we didn't pay attention to what he was asking us to do.
We were trying, with the information we had, to learn as much as we could, as quickly as we could.
This increased chatter, this talk, there's something not right. Specifically, I don't know. But I know the mood was they're going to hit us big.
Alarmed by these persistent rumors, Richard Clarke feels it is time to warn the new president. But days keep going by, and Clarke is unable to obtain the precious meeting.
Once, the president reacted. And his reaction was, you're giving me all these reports. There's going to be an attack here, there's going to be an attack there. I don't want to hear all these reports. I don't want to swat at flies. Give me a plan to do something about this. That word was given to the National Security Advisor, Condoleezza Rice. She came back to me with it, and I said, I gave you a plan. I gave you a plan in January. I've given it to you revised since then. I've been waiting for weeks to have that plan approved. The president wants a plan? Good. We want to give him a plan. And the answer was, well, good, let's go back to the committee and let's look at the plan, and we'll schedule something after we talk about Iraq, after we talk about China, after we talk about Star Wars. Finally, the week before 9/11, we have a senior level meeting. And at that meeting, I proposed, let's get the Predator armed, bring it back to Afghanistan, and start attacking bin Laden and al-Qaeda with it. Because by then we had it working. It had been ready for months. And September 4th, the CIA director and the senior person from the Pentagon, Wolfowitz, the senior person from the military, said, we do not want to arm the Predator. We do not want to fly the Predator in Afghanistan. We do not want to use the Predator to go after al-Qaeda.
Why?
CIA said, well, it's not our job to fly airplanes that kill people. And the Pentagon said, well, it's not our job to fly unmanned airplanes that kill people. But really what they were saying was, this could be controversial. Maybe we would hit the wrong target. Maybe there would be collateral damage. This would be expensive. We don't want to divert money from our pet programs for Dick Clark's pet program. Whatever the reason, they refused to do it.
On the morning of 9/11, Muhammad Atta leaves from the Portland airport. He is headed to Boston, where he will board his last flight. American Airlines AA-11, the first to crash into the World Trade Center. In just 1 hour, following a minutely prepared plan, the 19 hijackers board 4 different planes from several locations in the U.S. Everything is now set to turn this day into the most spectacular terrorist attack of our time.
We just knew it. We just knew that it was this volcano just waiting to erupt. And it did.
Very quickly, the U.S. government releases the portraits and identities of the 19 hijackers. The reason they managed to be so quick is that the CIA already knew of the existence of at least some of them.
If you ask me to explain how I feel about 9/11, I can't get beyond Khalid al-Midhar and Nawaf al-Hazmi. I can't get beyond that level of dysfunction. What about these two guys that are sitting here in the United States for a year plus? I don't know how those agents must feel.
Let me be careful. It's my belief that the Bureau wasn't notified of the meeting in Malaysia and the fact that these gentlemen had visas to come to the U.S. because John O'Neill would have gone apeshit and demanded to know every goddamn thing about that operation, who these guys were, their visa applications, put them on a watch notice, et cetera, and stop them. And then there are those that say, look, Mark, and perhaps they're right. That empty space where those buildings used to be in the back of my head would have come down eventually. That's their holy grail. So if we had stopped those 19 people, or those initial 2 people, 2 more would have come another method. They were going to bring down those damn towers no matter what. Just a matter of time. Maybe it didn't have to happen on that day. That's all. And who knows what it would have led to if they had been intercepted and followed. You don't know. And this is the difficulty with it.
Today, do you regret of not having disobeyed orders?
Every day of my life. Every day of my life. Every day of my life. There's nothing I can do about it. Nothing I can do about it. You want to condemn me? You want to attack me for other things that have happened in my life? You know, do the ad hominem attack. I really don't give a damn anymore. I really don't give a shit. I'm tired. I'm tired of being judged. I'm tired of it. I'm just sick of it. But I regret it. I regret it.
At first, after 9/11, when I heard about this, I was outraged, I was mad. And then when the 9/11 Commission investigated it, my conclusion initially was, well, there must have been a report that came into CIA perhaps on a Sunday, perhaps somebody was on vacation. I sort of thought there was probably one low-level person to blame. Well, now I know differently. Everybody involved in counterterrorism in the CIA knew about it, from the director on down. There were over 50 people who knew about it. 50. And they knew about it for over a year. And never once during that year did they tell me or the director of the FBI or the assistant director of the FBI in charge of counterterrorism. All of those 50 people kept it quiet, never told us for over a year. There was an intentional policy approved at a high level in CIA to deny the information to me and to the FBI.
You didn't ask DCI afterwards what happened?
I've never gotten a straight answer.
It's a crucial question.
It's a very crucial question.
to the citizens of this country, and certainly to the citizens of New York, to all those people that died that day, to the firemen and policemen who never asked a question. They just went and did their jobs, were never given any special treatment. To all those 4 people that saw their life unfold before them and jump out of that building, you've all seen the pictures. I mean, how do the survivors, these families, must feel? I mean, could any of us look them straight in the face and say, you know, we did everything we could? I think there are a lot of questions that still remain unanswered.
Thus, the journey leading to September 11th ends here. All the available pieces of the puzzle have been set into place. Some are still missing today, but the overall picture has become clearer and somehow even more frightening. Cairo, Moscow, and Washington. During the first part, we witnessed the rise of the jihadists, recruited, trained, and armed by the United States to fight against Soviets in Afghanistan. But in 1989, the world undergoes a radical change, and the USSR starts to unravel. Americans and jihadists lose their common enemy. Exhilarated by their victory against the Soviet Union, Islamists turn against their former protectors, driven by leaders whose hate of the Western world grew in Egyptian jails, such as Ayman al-Zawahiri and Sheikh Abdel Rahman, also known as the Blind Sheikh. For this particular group of Egyptians, the victory against Soviets isn't the end, but the beginning of a new battle, which they will now pursue on American soil. The FBI decides to increase its surveillance of the Sheikh, even managing to infiltrate his immediate circle, thanks to Ahmad Salem, the terrorist bomb maker who in reality is an undercover FBI agent. But following a dispute with his superiors, Ahmad abandons the mission. Terrorists are quick to find a replacement, a 34-year-old engineer, Ramzi Youssef. A few weeks later, the bomb is ready. It explodes on February 26, 1993, in the lower level of the World Trade Center. The road to terror is now a race against time, with terrorists always one step ahead, until the fateful morning of September 11, 2001. In the days that followed this first attack on the World Trade Center in New York, the FBI tries to convince Ahmad Salem to resume his undercover mission amongst the followers of Sheikh Abdel Rahman, also known as the Blind Sheikh.